There are wounds that never bleed, yet they ache every single day. They leave no scar that doctors can stitch, no bandage that can hold them in place, and yet they are the ones that cut deepest. These are the wounds left not by strangers, not by enemies, but by the very children we once held in our arms, kissed goodnight, and sacrificed our lives to protect. And because they are invisible, because they do not cry out in blood or bruises, the world around us rarely acknowledges them. But those who carry them know. Some wounds are not healed by time, but magnified by it. A broken arm may mend, a cut may fade, but the gash left in a parent's soul when their child looks at them with coldness, or worse, with contempt, that is something entirely different. It lingers. It returns in the quietest hours of the night, when the house is still, and the mind replays moments of neglect, of humiliation, of silence that spoke louder than words ever could. At 50, at 60, even at 70, a mother or father can find themselves lying awake whispering, "Did I deserve this?" And the cruelest truth is that sometimes there is no apology, no moment of return. Some children never look back, never offer recognition, never even attempt to heal what they so carelessly broke. They inhale a parent's love like oxygen, endless, invisible, free. And when they exhale, there is nothing in return but indifference. For many parents, this is the reality they live with, the quiet ache of being unseen, disrespected, or reduced to a mere function in their children's lives. But here is where philosophy, and especially Stoicism, offers us a way forward. Because these wounds, though real, though heavy, though unforgettable, do not have to define the rest of your life. You cannot control the choices of another, not even your own child. You cannot command respect from a heart unwilling to give it. But what you can control is whether you allow these hidden wounds to rob you of your dignity, your peace, and your right to live fully in the years you still have. And make no mistake, this is not just a story of one family or one culture. Across continents and generations, parents whisper the same pain in different languages. Why have I been forgotten? It is a universal wound, bound not to time or geography, but to the fragile thread of human relationships. To be overlooked by strangers stings. To be disregarded by one's own child devastates. Yet even in that devastation, a path remains, not of bitterness, not of resentment, but of reclamation. In this journey, I will share with you 7 wounds that children leave behind, scars that mothers and fathers across the world have carried in silence. Some of these wounds are etched in humiliating words, others in years of cold neglect, still others in the cruel distortion of conditional love or inherited shame. And while each one has its own sting, together they reveal a deeper truth about the human condition. We suffer not only because of what others do to us, but because of what we allow their actions to mean for our lives. The Stoics taught that peace is not found in controlling others but in mastering ourselves. These wounds, as brutal as they may feel, can become the very teachers that guide us back to our own center. They are not the end of the story, unless we let them be. And if you stay with me, if you are willing to look at them not with denial but with courage, you may discover that the very pain you thought would break you can instead become the foundation of your dignity. So let me say this clearly. Stay with me, because naming these wounds is not about drowning in sorrow. It is about cutting through illusions. It is the first step to freedom. And as we begin, remember, you are not alone, and your story, no matter how bruised, no matter how forgotten, still deserves respect. Neglect rarely arrives with thunder. It doesn't crash through the door with shouting or accusations. It comes quietly, almost politely, slipping into your life so slowly you barely notice it until the silence has already settled in. At first, it looks like a missed call, a shorter visit, a conversation that ends too quickly. You tell yourself they are busy, that life is fast, that everyone is caught up in their own storms. And maybe that's true for a while. But gradually, patterns emerge. Fewer calls, less sharing, an empty chair at the table where once there was laughter and closeness. This is how silent contempt takes root. Not in the words spoken, but in the words withheld. Not in the rejection that explodes, but in the indifference that whispers. You look at your phone and realize it has been weeks since you last heard their voice. You find out about major life events from others, not from the ones you raised. When you do speak, it feels transactional, stripped of warmth. What hurts most isn't the distance itself. It's the message hidden inside that distance, that your presence no longer matters. I once heard a story of an old man who lived alone in a quiet town. Every morning he set 2 cups of coffee on the kitchen table, one for himself, one for his son. The neighbors would pass by and shake their heads. Some whispered he was eccentric, perhaps even losing his mind. But when asked why he kept doing it, the old man replied, "I just want to remember what it felt like to be seen." That small ritual was his way of holding on to dignity in the face of absence. It revealed a truth that many bury deep inside. The most painful loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being invisible to those you love most. Psychologists tell us that invisibility corrodes more deeply than outright conflict. To be hated, at least, is to be acknowledged. But to be ignored, to be treated as though your voice, your sacrifices, your very existence no longer carry weight. That is a wound without visible scar, but one that lingers in the marrow. Over time, it reshapes the way you see yourself. You begin to wonder, am I still needed? Do I still matter? Or have I already been erased from the story I helped create? Marcus Aurelius once reflected that indifference wounds more deeply than injury, because when someone injures you, they admit that you exist. But indifference denies your very being. This is the cruelty of silent contempt. It turns decades of sacrifice into background noise. It reduces the parent who once carried the weight of sleepless nights, school fees, and endless worries into little more than an afterthought. Here, the Stoic path becomes clear. You cannot control the affection of another. You cannot summon their attention by waiting, by hoping, by twisting yourself into knots of longing. But you can choose how you respond to the silence. You can stop begging for recognition that may never come, and instead reclaim the ground that was always yours, your dignity. Stoicism does not ask you to harden your heart. It asks you to see clearly what lies within your control and what does not, and to choose freedom over longing. That does not mean the wound stops hurting. Pain will visit, just as memory does. But it means the wound no longer defines your worth. You are not simply the forgotten parent, the neglected friend, the invisible partner. You are still the soul who endured, who gave, who can now choose to live without waiting for someone else's gaze to confirm that you exist. And this is where action takes shape. Just as the man with the 2 cups of coffee found his ritual, you too can create daily reminders, not rituals of waiting, but rituals of affirmation. Maybe it's a morning walk where you repeat to yourself, "I matter." Maybe it's lighting a candle each evening, not for who is absent, but for the light that still burns within you. These acts may seem small, but they carry immense power. They remind you that your existence is not dependent on anyone else's recognition. Silent contempt is cruel, yes, but it also reveals the truth that liberation is possible. Because once you stop excusing neglect, once you stop diminishing yourself in the hope of crumbs, you step into a different kind of life. One where absence no longer dictates your worth, and where your presence, even if unseen, still carries dignity. That step, trembling though it may be, is the beginning of awakening. There are wounds that strike not in private silence, but in the harsh glare of others' eyes. If silent contempt makes you invisible, public humiliation does the opposite. It makes you visible, but only as an object of ridicule, and the cruelty lies in how subtle it often appears. Rarely does it come as an outright insult shouted across a crowded room. More often, it hides inside a sarcastic remark, a dismissive laugh, or a cutting correction dropped casually in front of friends, relatives, or even strangers. You speak and your words are met not with respect, but with a smirk. You share an opinion, and your child interrupts with a condescending tone. That's outdated. You don't really understand. You recall a story from your own life, and they roll their eyes, dismissing the very experiences that once shaped the person they have now become. It is in these small, seemingly harmless gestures that a deeper wound is carved. Because humiliation, even when wrapped in sarcasm, rewrites your story. It reduces years of sacrifice and wisdom into a caricature. The outdated parent, the irrelevant elder, the one whose voice no longer carries weight. The emotional effect is devastating. Respect is the soil from which dignity grows, and when that soil is stripped away in front of others, something inside withers. It is not only embarrassment in the moment, it is a slow erosion that lingers. You begin to hesitate before speaking. You second-guess your own memories, your own authority. In gatherings, you retreat into silence not because you have nothing to say, but because humiliation has taught you that your voice is a liability. Psychologists call this dynamic projection. The child who belittles a parent in public is rarely motivated by truth. More often, they are using the parent as a canvas for their own unprocessed frustrations, their unresolved insecurities, their hidden regrets. Instead of confronting their failures, they displace them outward, aiming at the safest target. The person they know will not retaliate in cruelty. And because love often softens the parent's response, the child continues unchecked, finding comfort in sarcasm, in ridicule, in cutting remarks that allow them to avoid looking inward. From a Stoic perspective, this is where clarity must prevail. Seneca once warned that the noble soul despises petty attacks, not because they are painless, but because responding with equal venom is to lose twice. Humiliation tempts you to strike back, to return insult for insult. But such reaction only deepens the wound. True dignity lies not in silence that accepts disrespect, nor in anger that mirrors it, but in naming the harm with calm precision and setting boundaries without venom. Think of humiliation as acid. A single drop may not burn through the surface immediately, but over time, left unchallenged, it corrodes everything it touches. Sarcasm that goes unchecked, ridicule that is swallowed without response. These are the drops that eat away at dignity. But like acid, humiliation can be neutralized when brought into the light, when countered with clarity rather than resentment. This does not mean shaming the child in return. It means saying, firmly but without rage, "Do not speak to me that way." It means reclaiming your right to be addressed with respect, even if your voice trembles the first time you defend it. Boundaries are not acts of rebellion. They are acts of dignity. And each time you assert them, you plant a seed of resilience in soil that humiliation once tried to strip bare. If silent contempt made you feel invisible, public humiliation seeks to make you small. But the Stoic truth is that your size is not dictated by another's words. You are not diminished because someone laughs at your story. You are not irrelevant because someone mocks your wisdom. You are diminished only when you accept their distortion as truth. So the choice stands before you: to shrink in the face of ridicule, or to stand with calm strength, refusing to surrender your story. Humiliation may burn like acid, but your dignity, once reclaimed, is the stone that it cannot dissolve. Not all love is love. Sometimes what is offered in its name is nothing more than a contract, a bargain disguised as affection. This is the wound of conditional love, where warmth is tied to performance, where respect appears only when you serve a purpose, and where your worth is measured not by who you are but by what you provide. You know this wound when kindness comes only after obedience, when tenderness vanishes the moment you say no, when respect is given not freely, but only as a temporary reward for meeting demands. A parent living under this shadow begins to internalize a painful message: I am only valuable if I keep giving. If I stop, I am nothing. The emotional toll is immense. Instead of living from the solid ground of dignity, you begin to live on shifting sand, constantly adjusting yourself in fear of rejection. Every conversation becomes a negotiation. Every silence feels like punishment. You start to measure your words, your gestures, even your generosity, not out of freedom, but out of survival, as if love were something you had to earn again and again. I once knew of a mother who worked tirelessly into her later years. Her children seldom called, seldom visited, but when they needed something, money, a favor, a solution to a crisis, suddenly her phone would ring. In those moments, they were kind. They said the right words, expressed gratitude, even affection. But once the favor was delivered, once the money transferred, the warmth evaporated. The cycle repeated so often that she began to dread her phone vibrating, knowing each call meant not closeness but another withdrawal from a well that was already running dry. This is not love, it is manipulation. And manipulation masquerading as love is one of the most corrosive poisons in family life. For the parent caught in its grip, it creates an endless hunger, a desperate hope that this time the affection will be genuine, that this time the kindness will last beyond the transaction. But the cycle always repeats, and each repetition deepens the wound. Epictetus once warned with piercing clarity, "If your peace depends on the applause of others, you are no longer free." The applause may come from crowds, from friends, or even from your own children. It makes no difference. If your inner calm rises and falls based on whether others approve, then you are performing, not living. And performance, as a way of life, is the slowest path to despair. So how does one heal this wound? Not by hardening into bitterness. Stoicism never calls for the death of love. Instead, it calls for its purification. True love does not demand servitude. It does not vanish when boundaries are drawn. It does not reduce a parent to a wallet, a servant, or a convenience. True love respects dignity because it grows from dignity. The healing principle, then, is to reverse the terms. Instead of whispering, "I will give myself away so that I may be loved," the declaration becomes, "I will love, but never at the cost of my peace." That shift may sound subtle, but it is revolutionary. It moves you from being a hostage to affection to being a sovereign of your own worth. Of course, this doesn't erase the sting of rejection when love is withheld. It doesn't silence the ache of longing when a child pulls away because you refuse to comply. But it does change the meaning of those moments. Instead of seeing them as evidence of your inadequacy, you begin to see them for what they are. Evidence of manipulation failing to control you. And that recognition is the beginning of freedom. Conditional love seeks to convince you that you are negotiable. Stoicism reminds you that your value is not up for debate. You were worthy before the demand. You are worthy after the refusal. And once you reclaim that ground, the chains of conditional love snap. So let this truth anchor you. You are not here to perform for affection, to barter your dignity for scraps of warmth. You are here to live with peace, to love without chains, and to walk with a freedom that no conditional bargain can take away. There is a moment, subtle yet devastating, when you realize that the seat you once held in your family's story has quietly been taken by someone else. It doesn't arrive with arguments or dramatic rejection. Instead, it appears in the small details. Plans made without your input. Conversations that move on without pausing for your perspective. Decisions finalized as if your voice no longer carries weight. You are present, yes, but no longer central. This is the wound of emotional replacement. Psychologists call it social displacement, the quiet erosion of perceived value within a group, often within the very family you once anchored. It's not that you are hated. It's not even that you are openly dismissed. It's that you've been quietly replaced. And this realization cuts deep because it violates one of the most fundamental human needs, the need to belong. At first, you question yourself. Am I overreacting? Maybe I'm being selfish. Perhaps I should just be grateful they include me at all. But beneath these rationalizations lies a sharper truth. You feel invisible not because you've disappeared, but because the space you once occupied is now filled by others. Maybe by new partners, new friends, or new rituals that no longer involve you. The spiral begins almost imperceptibly. You speak less, not because you are practicing stoic restraint, but because you are afraid of being intrusive. You withdraw, not from wisdom, but from fear. Each step back builds the invisible cage higher, until you are left waiting on the sidelines of your own life, hoping for an invitation that rarely comes. I once heard the story of a woman in her 70s. For decades, she had been the center of her family's traditions. Holidays meant her home. Birthdays meant her cooking. Her presence was woven into every memory. But as the years passed, those traditions shifted elsewhere. Invitations dwindled. Her house, once filled with laughter, grew quiet. She grieved deeply, feeling discarded, irrelevant. But then she made a choice. Instead of disappearing, she joined a local community group. She began teaching younger women the skills she had carried for decades: cooking, sewing, wisdom about life's storms. Slowly, she became the emotional center of a new circle, one that cherished her contributions. When asked about her children, she smiled and said, "I gave them roots. Now I give others wings." Her story is not about denial. It's about resilience. It's about refusing to let emotional replacement turn into self-erasure. This is the essence of Stoic strength, not clinging to the roles life has taken from you, but creating new ones rooted in dignity. Marcus Aurelius once reminded himself, "The soul becomes stronger when it accepts its role in the universe without envy, but also without surrender." What does that mean here? It means you stop measuring your worth by whether others still place you at the center. You cannot control if they choose new traditions, new confidants, new priorities, but you can control whether you abandon yourself. The core lesson is this: you are irreplaceable when you return to your own center. The world may try to shift you into the background, but no one else can occupy the space that belongs to you, the space of your own life, your own dignity, your own presence. And when you claim that ground again, something remarkable happens. You no longer compete for attention. You radiate it. You no longer beg to be chosen. You become a source of strength others naturally gravitate toward. So if you feel replaced, remember this truth: displacement by others does not mean disappearance of self. The invitation is not to mourn the stage you lost, but to build a new one. And when you do, you discover that the power to belong was never theirs to give. It was always yours to claim. And if these words strike a chord with you, if you've ever felt pushed aside or quietly erased, know this: you are not alone. Here, in this community, we confront the truths others are afraid to name. If you want more of these reflections, more of this unfiltered Stoic strength, make sure you subscribe to True Stoic Way. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and let's continue building a space where no one's story is forgotten. Because dignity doesn't come from waiting to be invited back into someone else's circle. It comes from choosing to stand firmly in your own. Few wounds cut as cruelly as blame that is undeserved. It often comes in whispered accusations, in pointed remarks, in the rewriting of history. You were too demanding. You were too absent. You were too controlling. You were too weak. You were never enough. These words may sound different in each family, but their weight is the same. They reduce decades of sacrifice into a single, distorted narrative, one that paints the parent not as a protector or a provider, but as the villain in their child's story. This is projected blame. Psychologists use the term to describe the way people deposit their unresolved frustrations, failures, and insecurities onto someone else. And who better to bear that weight in their eyes than the parent? After all, they know that love will soften the retaliation, that guilt will silence protest. So they shift their burden onto the very person who once carried them through sleepless nights and endless storms. The effect is devastating. Many parents, especially mothers, accept the accusations without resistance, out of love, or exhaustion, or simply a lifelong habit of self-sacrifice. They internalize the words. Over time, those accusations take root. A woman who once believed she had done her best begins to second-guess every decision she made. She replays moments from decades earlier, tormenting herself with if-only scenarios. She apologizes endlessly, not just to her children but to herself, for wounds she isn't even sure she caused. What emerges is not love anymore, but emotional slavery disguised as devotion. Living in a state of penance, she carries the weight of someone else's bitterness as though it were her natural inheritance. Instead of remembering the nights she worked 2 jobs, or the sacrifices that kept food on the table, she remembers only the accusations. And when this distorted memory takes hold, it corrodes health, erodes confidence, and chains the spirit. Marcus Aurelius offered a piercing antidote. The soul becomes invincible when it judges itself honestly. The power of unfair blame lies in the fact that we accept it as absolute truth. The moment you step back and view your life with balance and compassion, the chains begin to loosen. To judge yourself honestly does not mean to deny mistakes. Of course, mistakes were made. Every human life contains them. But to let those mistakes eclipse a lifetime of endurance, is not honesty. It is distortion. Practical healing begins here. Place mistakes in context. Remember the lack of resources you faced, the guidance you never had, the storms you weathered with what little you could carry. To acknowledge your humanity is not to escape responsibility, but to restore fairness. You were not perfect, but you were enough. And enough is not a crime. When you embrace this truth, something shifts. You stop living as a defendant in someone else's trial. You stop rehearsing the role of the guilty, bowing under the weight of endless cross-examination. Instead, you step into the role of a witness to your own truth. You can admit the flaws without surrendering the dignity of the whole story. And here is the Stoic freedom. Your worth is not up for judgment by another's resentment. You are not the executioner of their pain, nor the scapegoat for their disappointments. You shaped them, yes, they shaped you as well. But their life is not your sentence to carry. When you refuse to surrender your dignity, the poison of unfair blame loses its grip. So if you find yourself trapped in this cycle, let this be the moment of release. Stop apologizing for being human. Stop living as though you must serve a lifelong penance for imagined crimes. Stand in the clarity of your truth. I was not flawless, but I was faithful. I was not perfect, but I was enough. And if these words resonate with you, I invite you to pause and affirm them out loud. Better yet, write them in the comments. I was enough. It's not just a phrase, it's an act of reclaiming the narrative. And if you want to continue walking this path of Stoic clarity, where guilt loses its chains and dignity is restored, subscribe to True Stoic Way. Together, we're building not just a channel, but a community where truth is no longer buried beneath blame. Because you are not a defendant, you are the rightful author of your own story, and no one has the power to erase that truth but you. There is a kind of abandonment that is far more corrosive than distance, and far more exhausting than open conflict. It is not marked by slammed doors or severed ties. In fact, on the surface, everything may appear intact. Your name still sits in their phone contacts, they know where you live, and they reach out just often enough to keep appearances alive. But beneath that surface lies the truth. You are no longer seen as a soul. You are treated only as a function. This is functional abandonment, a wound more insidious because it hides beneath the illusion of connection. The calls still come, but they are requests for help, not invitations into intimacy. The visits happen, but only when something is needed. Money, errands, practical support. Important decisions are made without you, and only after the fact are you informed. Your presence has been reduced to utility, stripped of reverence, stripped of belonging. At first you excuse it. They're busy. Life is complicated. This is what independence looks like. But over time, the excuses collapse under the weight of reality. What was once an occasional absence becomes a pattern, and patterns harden into identity. You begin to feel like a resource, always available, rarely cherished. The tragedy is not simply that they stopped seeing you, but that slowly, you begin to stop seeing yourself. The emotional erosion is brutal. Studies have shown that prolonged invisibility within families is tied to heightened anxiety, weakened immunity, and even accelerated cognitive decline. Why? Because when you internalize neglect, your body reacts as though life itself is slipping away. You withdraw further, not out of stoic calm, but out of exhaustion. You convince yourself that silence is maturity, but in truth, it is resignation, the slow death of the spirit. The hard truth is this: gratitude for scraps is not dignity. To tell yourself you should be thankful for the occasional phone call, the half-hearted visit, the perfunctory "how are you," is to sell your soul cheaply. That is not respect, that is survival. But here is where Stoicism pierces through with clarity. Epictetus reminded us that what diminishes us is not the act itself, but the way we interpret it. If you interpret neglect as your deserved role, you chain yourself to their choices. If you see it for what it is, their limitation, their failure to meet you in love, then you reclaim your freedom. You cannot force intimacy where it no longer flows, but you can refuse to define yourself by its absence. Reframing this wound is painful, but liberating. Solitude, when accepted not as punishment but as clarity, becomes strength. To walk alone does not mean to live unloved. It means to release yourself from the humiliating bargain of begging for recognition. It means deciding that your existence, your worth, your light will not flicker only when someone else chooses to acknowledge it. Think of yourself as a lamp. A lamp that waits to be switched on by others will burn out long before its time. But a lamp that shines by its own choice illuminates not only its own path, but the paths of those who are wise enough to notice. Functional abandonment tempts you to believe you have no switch of your own. Stoicism reminds you that you always do. So if you find yourself used but unseen, present but not valued, remember this: your life is too precious to live on hold. Do not confuse utility with love. Do not confuse scraps with dignity. Choose instead to reclaim your own light, and when you shine from within, you will no longer live waiting for recognition. You will live as proof that recognition was never required in the first place. And if this truth resonates with you, I invite you to stand with us, a community that refuses to live half-erased. Comment below with the words, "I choose dignity over scraps." Let the world know you are done settling for less than respect. And if you haven't already, subscribe to True Stoic Way, because here, we face the wounds others are too afraid to name, and together, we learn how to turn them into strength. Because your presence is not a function, it is a light, and that light deserves to shine without permission. Of all the wounds left behind, perhaps the cruelest is the one that never truly belonged to you. It is inherited shame, the slow, corrosive belief that because you were not flawless, you somehow deserve to be disrespected. It is the lie whispered into your heart that your imperfections justify contempt, that your humanity cancels out your worth. This wound often begins in small, cutting remarks. You didn't give enough. You didn't love the right way. You weren't there when I needed you. Decades of sacrifice are erased in a single sentence, as if the sleepless nights, the double shifts, the dreams you laid down were nothing more than failures stacked against you. And because you have spent a lifetime trying to be fair, you begin to believe them. You convince yourself that your cracks disqualify you, that your love was inadequate because it wasn't perfect. I once heard of a mother who spent her entire youth and strength raising her children. She worked 2 jobs, kept food on the table, held the house together through storms of poverty and uncertainty. Her own dreams were buried quietly, sacrificed so her children could have what she never had. But decades later, she was told she should feel guilty. Guilty for not being more present. Guilty for not providing luxuries that were never within reach. Guilty for not loving in a way that perfectly matched someone else's imagination. That accusation wasn't truth. It was projection. And yet, she carried it as though it were her natural inheritance. This is how inherited shame works. It takes the weight of someone else's dissatisfaction and straps it across your shoulders. It tricks you into thinking that carrying this load is your duty, that the endless rehearsing of old accusations is proof of love. But in reality, it is not humility. It is self-erasure. Here, Stoicism speaks with piercing clarity. Seneca once wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." Inherited shame is the perfect embodiment of this principle. The pain does not come from what truly happened. It comes from the endless echo of accusations repeated in your mind, long after the voices have stopped speaking. It is not reality that chains you, but the imagination, rehearsing a distorted script. And yet reality tells a different story. Reality says that you endured when it would have been easier to collapse. Reality says that you gave what you could, with the resources you had, in circumstances few others could have survived. Reality says that imperfection does not erase value. In fact, endurance, scarred, imperfect, stubborn endurance, is proof of strength, not evidence of failure. Think of the scarred old tree that stood in the center of a village. Its bark was rough, its branches crooked, its shade imperfect. Some mocked it, saying it should be cut down for straighter wood, for prettier timber. But when storms came, it was that tree, weathered, scarred, unshapely, that stood firm, shielding the villagers and holding the ground from washing away. Its imperfections were not its weakness. They were the very marks of its survival. So it is with you. The cracks in your story, the scars on your soul, the moments you wish had been different. These do not erase your worth. They are the very proof that you endured, that you stood when others would have fallen. If you carry inherited shame, let this truth take root. You were never meant to live the last chapters of your life apologizing. You were meant to live them with dignity, not begging for recognition, but standing as proof that endurance itself is sacred. And remember this: shame belongs to those who refuse to love without blaming, not to you. Their inability to offer gratitude does not cancel your sacrifices. Their bitterness does not cancel your worth. You were never meant to carry their dissatisfaction as your cross, so let it go. Let the accusations fall away like dead leaves in autumn. Stand like the old tree, scarred, imperfect, but unshakable. Because what others mock, what others call flawed, is often the very strength that saves lives in the storm. And if you've ever carried shame that was never yours, write it down below. My scars are my strength. Let the words be a declaration, not just for you, but for all who need to hear them. And if you want to keep walking this path of clarity and dignity, join us here on True Stoic Way. Subscribe, so that together we can continue naming the wounds, breaking the illusions, and reclaiming the strength that was always within us. Because shame ends the moment you refuse to carry what was never yours, and freedom begins the moment you choose dignity over apology. We have named them all now, the 7 wounds that children leave behind, not always out of malice but often out of neglect, projection, or their own unhealed battles. Silent contempt, public humiliation, conditional love, emotional replacement, unfair blame, functional abandonment, and inherited shame. Each wound has its own sting, its own way of burrowing into the soul, and together they form a weight that many parents carry into their later years, dragging it like a chain that no one else can see. At first it feels unbearable, to be invisible in silence, to be mocked in public, to have affection rationed out like currency, to be quietly replaced, to stand accused for crimes you never committed, to be present yet unseen, functional but unloved, to inherit shame that was never yours to begin with. These are not small injuries. They are heavy, and they tempt resignation. They whisper, "You are finished. You are irrelevant. You are only what they say you are." But here lies the hidden paradox. Within each wound is not only pain, but also the seed of liberation. Silent contempt forces you to stop waiting for recognition and to begin affirming your own existence. Public humiliation pushes you to set boundaries and reclaim dignity without rage. Conditional love teaches you that true freedom comes only when you no longer perform for approval. Emotional replacement reminds you that belonging cannot be begged. It must first be found within yourself. Unfair blame demands that you judge your own life with honesty, not through the lens of someone else's resentment. Functional abandonment calls you to stop mistaking utility for love, to shine as a light that doesn't need permission. And inherited shame, perhaps the cruelest, reveals the ultimate truth. Imperfection does not erase value. Endurance itself is sacred proof of strength. This is where Stoicism offers its most profound gift. The Stoics never promised that life would be free from betrayal, neglect, or pain. They promised something greater, that no matter what others do, you always retain sovereignty over your mind. You cannot control the choices of your children. You cannot dictate their respect or force their love, but you can control how you interpret their actions, how you choose to live in the aftermath, and whether you allow their failings to define your worth. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." This is the core of Stoic liberation. It is not about denying the wound. It is about refusing to let the wound become your identity. It is about reclaiming what no one else can take unless you surrender it. Your dignity, your peace, your ability to live as more than a victim of someone else's choices. True peace, then, is not the absence of conflict. It is not found in waiting for reconciliation that may never come. It is not in begging for apologies that may never be spoken. True peace is sovereignty of the mind, the calm strength that comes from mastering your own interpretation. When you stop saying, "I will be free when they change," and begin saying, "I am free because I choose to live with dignity now," then no wound can defeat you. Perhaps you hear this and think, "But the pain still hurts." And of course it does. Stoicism never denies pain. It denies slavery to pain. The scars will remain, but scars are proof of survival, not evidence of weakness. The pain may visit, but it does not have to rule you. It can become a teacher, a reminder that even in the darkest chapters you endured. So let me leave you with this reflection. Your story deserves respect. Not the shallow respect of empty words from those who refuse to see you, but the deeper respect that begins within yourself. When you look back on your life, do not let the narrative be written only by contempt, humiliation, or blame. Write it with honesty. Yes, you were imperfect. Yes, mistakes were made. But you endured storms, gave more than you received, and kept standing when others would have collapsed. That is not failure. That is strength. And now the choice is yours, to keep carrying the wounds as chains, or to see them as markers of the path that led you to this moment of clarity, to keep waiting for recognition, or to step forward into freedom. Stoicism does not erase the past, but it transforms the way you carry it, from burden into lesson, from shame into dignity, from pain into liberation. So pause for a moment, breathe deeply, and whisper it to yourself, or write it boldly in the comments. My story deserves respect. Because the act of naming it is not symbolic, it is the first step to freedom. You were never meant to live begging for scraps of affection. Not from strangers, not from friends, and certainly not from the very children whose lives were built on your sacrifices. Every wound we've uncovered, the silence, the humiliation, the conditional bargains, the quiet replacement, the unjust blame, the functional neglect, and the inherited shame, they all share one dangerous whisper: settle for less. Accept this as your fate. But fate is not a prison. It is a challenge, and dignity begins the moment you stop excusing what should never have been acceptable. So let this be your manifesto, not written in ink, but carved into the way you live from this moment forward. First, stop excusing disrespect. Love does not justify humiliation. Sacrifice does not mean surrender. To explain away cruelty, to make excuses for neglect, is to betray yourself twice. Once in the wound, and once in your silence. From today on, draw a line. Let your soul declare with clarity: I will not excuse what diminishes me. Second, reclaim boundaries with clarity. Boundaries are not walls to keep love out. They are walls to keep dignity in. They are not rebellion. They are self-respect. To say, "Do not speak to me that way," or "I will not be treated as a function but as a person," is not cruelty. It is justice. And justice begins in the way you treat yourself. Third, live with dignity regardless of recognition. The world may overlook you. Your children may fail to see the depth of your sacrifices, but dignity does not depend on applause. It is not granted by their words. It is affirmed by your choices. True freedom is to live in such a way that whether you are seen or unseen, honored or ignored, your life radiates strength. This is the Stoic way. Marcus Aurelius taught that the soul is stronger when it stands firm in what it knows to be right, regardless of what others say or do. Seneca reminded us that we suffer more from imagination than reality. Epictetus declared that no one can chain your mind unless you hand them the key. And now those teachings converge into a simple truth for you. You are not defined by wounds, but by the courage with which you rise above them. So take this as your call to action, not just for this video, but for your life. Like this message if it struck where it hurt, because acknowledgement is the first act of healing. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their pain is not madness, not weakness, but the echo of wounds that many endure in silence. And subscribe to True Stoic Way, because here we do not sugarcoat. We speak the truths that set you free. And I ask you to do one more thing, not for me, but for yourself. Leave a comment with the words, "My story deserves respect," followed by the country you're watching from. Why? Because writing it down is an act of defiance against silence. It is a public declaration that you will not live erased. And when you see others writing it too, you will realize you are not alone. You are part of a global community, reclaiming dignity together. Never forget, you did not just watch a video. You reclaimed a piece of yourself. You stood, even if just for a moment, taller than the wounds that tried to bend you. And that is where liberation begins. So walk forward now, not as a victim of contempt or blame, but as a bearer of dignity. Not begging for recognition, but living in such a way that even if no one applauds, your life still shines with quiet strength. Because your story does deserve respect, and respect begins when you claim it for yourself.